So I'm Jackson Calder. I have a master's in strategic studies from Victoria University. I used to play around in some kind of foreign policy and diplomatic circles in Wellington for a few years, and then kind of moved away from policy and more into national security, risk management, and I dabbled in intelligence a little bit. I'm also a board member of Risk New Zealand, and I'm also more recently a civil defence, volunteer civil defence responder with RT3 West, based in Henderson. So have more recently kind of skilled up in emergency management and things like that. So if there's anyone, NEMA or emergency management people or like district council people in the room, I'm keen to chat with you. Got deployed a few times last weekend for a slip in Muriwai, 2 weekends ago for a slip in Muriwai and some flooding out west and things of that nature. So today we'll be talking about geopolitical risk. So, okay, we're going to just wing this. So, the general geopolitical view, that is a very oversimplified view. Please don't read that as the Bible. Right now, we have an emerging multipolarity, which is the international relations literature says is the most unstable type of international system. During the Cold War, for example, we had a bipolar international system, and it was a Cold War because it was stable and it kind of never went hot, because that's actually a very stable conflict or tension dichotomy. Multipolarity is not stable. You have a lot of states that have increased influence and increased power and have the political will and the kind of economic and military capability to pursue what they want to in the world. What that looks like is states are pursuing spheres of influence. This is kind of China moving further into the Middle East, into Pakistan and stuff, and moving into Africa and building ports and railways and infrastructure in Africa, and then permanently placing military personnel and equipment there. Very much mirroring what the US has done with worldwide basing. China is also moving into the South Pacific and pursuing spheres of influence with the Pacific Islands through, you might have seen the news recently with the Cook Islands, striking up agreements, much to the dismay of the New Zealand government. And then you have kind of rising middle powers, I'd say. In the next 10 years, we want to be looking at Indonesia, maybe Brazil. We want to be looking at Iran and North Korea as more and more willing and able to throw their weight around in the international system. Then you also have the traditional guarantors of international security, which is America, which is increasingly becoming an unreliable partner for many nations. A bit of a fickle kind of relationship. And you see that in Europe now. NATO is trying to consolidate itself and be like, we can secure ourselves without America funding it. Whether they can actually do that remains to be seen. Global market volatility and the rise of tech giants among chip war semiconductors. You all might have heard of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. I think that's what it's called. That is what every major tech company in the world relies on, is like the semiconductors coming out of Taiwan. China is trying to become independent with semiconductors. America is trying to become independent. There's a company called Texas Instruments, which are trying to kind of compete with Taiwan. I think it was a couple of years ago, there was like a semiconductor shortage. Was this right? And the price of cars were going up because of it and stuff. People are nodding. Okay, I'm not crazy. This is becoming a more and more and more important kind of arena in international politics, is who makes the tech and where does it come from. Like NVIDIA just became the most valuable company in the history the world. I think it's like $4 trillion or something. You know, they're fundamentally a chip manufacturer. Increasing protectionism and transactional mindsets overriding values-based relationships. This is the classic like Trump playbook, which is like, what will you do for me? Overriding the traditional, like, yes, we've been friends, we know each other, we transact based on a shared set of values. It's very much, you know, he's going into Ukraine and saying, who wants to make a deal? It's not based on what the rules-based international order says should happen, which is like everyone should play by the rules, we should form values-based relationships and things. He's going in and saying, I'll give you this, you know, you give me that. That's starting to override traditional relationships, and that's raising tensions. Yeah, I think that's what I'm saying. Political risk, like I just mentioned. Who are we buying tech from? Who are we sharing information with? What's our supply chain footprint? What else are our partners engaged in? Political risk, I'd say, is primarily reputational risk. You know, we've seen in Israel-Palestine right now a lot of kind of boycott Israeli goods, or this company is investing in Israel, so we're going to boycott them, or we're going to cut our partnership with them, or divest from them, etc. These things are becoming increasingly kind of potent little vectors for you know, wanting to or not wanting to do business with a certain company or a certain group or buy a certain product. And there's all conflicts happening all over the world, like certain chips that we make in New Zealand end up in Chinese, you know, missiles and things like that. Well, at least they used to, I don't know if they still do. Global ideological movements too, protest movements, civil unrest, crime, you know, say the Palestine protests happening on like US university campuses and things like that, that feeds into here, and we've seen a bit of it here too. This is a little bit more of an accurate view, but still very simplified, and you could probably argue that a few of these are not right. I think two of these are just, I'd say that. These are general spheres of influence. I'm not going to link that too long. So, financial incentives often trump principles and values, modern slavery, weapons, dual-use tech, AI, ethics, etc. Companies may say one thing and do another. It's an emerging risk. Just be cognizant of who you're doing business with, where your supply chain goes through. Inflationary pressures, migration, and aging populations create economic challenges. Who's moving where, to do what job, and for how long? You know, Japan has always been an incredibly strong economy for like how small a country it is, but they have, I think, the oldest population in the world. So their kind of demographics are this big kind of slow-moving national security trend, but they're starting to manifest in Japan, and they're feeling a lot of economic pressure. A lot of people have been traveling to Japan in the past couple of years because the yen is really weak. You know, why is the yen weak? They've got a lot of economic challenges right now that are mainly demographic, I'd say, driven by demographics. Resource insecurity is raising costs and tensions. Luckily, New Zealand is pretty resilient to resource insecurity, although we do have like power-related, energy-related problems sometimes, especially like drought, hydrothermal energy. But if we're looking at, say, you know, India and Pakistan, somewhere regions in the Middle East as well, there are communities already fighting wars over access to water, and they have been for 10 years, and it's just going to get worse as they heat up, and heat up. And then you're going to see, I suspect, mass migration away from the equator in like 30 years' time, because it will just be like too hot, and it will just be no water in some areas. Global grey market, sanctions evasion, tax havens, foreign investment, and political donations. And those are a few news articles, it looks like, for examples of these things in the news. I saw that Russia is offering like a university degree in tax evasion now. It's pretty cool actually, I'd like to see the curriculum. But, you know, that's an economic reality for them. They get sanctioned hard, they get their assets frozen. They know it's not going to go away anytime soon because they're not going to change, Putin isn't going to change how he behaves. He wants to keep pursuing his interests in the international system, expanding the spheres of influence. He's what we call a revisionist state. I would say China is too. It means they are interested in revising the rules-based international order to suit them. Since World War II, we've been under the international rules-based order designed by the US and the United Nations more broadly. That is being increasingly contested by revisionist states. I would also add that an important thing to remember is that New Zealand is a price taker, not a price maker. We don't have a lot of weight to go around in the international system. We do tend to punch above our weight, and we're really good at developing international relationships through really nice specialised things like peacekeeping, doing peacekeeping, or special forces operations, or disaster emergency response personnel sitting overseas, things like that. And countries remember that, and that's a relationship building thing. But generally, we're a price taker, and that means we're kind of at the mercy of some of the bigger players in the international system, so we have to remember that. This is a really fun tool. This is an impact uncertainty matrix. We build a lot of these for all sorts of topics. If anyone in the room's read our risk report, 2024 risk report, there's like 8 of these that we did. These are a really nice snapshot of the strategic environment. So you've got impact on one axis and uncertainty on the other axis. In the top right, the grey, dark grey is like your critical uncertainties zone. That's the kind of trends that have the highest potential impact and the highest amount of uncertainty as to like how they'll play out, how and when. We can follow threads and kind of pull on a few threads to see where they go and what other risks we're looking at, risks and trends. So some of the critical uncertainties you have here in the global strategic competition, which is just kind of a more nerdy term for geopolitics, is biotech, AI, space and counter space, industrial espionage, sovereign digital spheres, malign influence operations, energy insecurity, logistics vulnerability, resource scarcity. These are really fun to kind of map what you think is in the strategic environment, and then you can pull out a couple of critical uncertainties and then do some futures modeling and really write some scenarios and see how that trend might extrapolate 5 years, 10 years into the future. That's a good snapshot, I think, of what we're looking at, or at least last year, I think is when I wrote that. Okay. Getting a bit more into the pointy end of what this means. As you can tell already, I'm kind of a security expert. There's a lot of like the regulatory side and the finance side and the insurance side of geopolitics, which I'm not a specialist in. So this whole presentation does lean a bit towards the security stuff. So political risk, how do geopolitical shifts influence my partners, investors, and clients? Who's in what region, what are they exposed to politically, ideologically? This is getting more potent, as I said before, as a risk for us. New Zealand companies are increasingly seeking partners overseas, which is really great to see. We've always kind of struggled with those economies of scale, and really hitting that next level of like revenue or number of employees, or how large an operation you can get. New Zealand is only so big, so increasingly we're looking for overseas partners, right? But increasingly, overseas is more and more unstable. So there's a lot of inherent risk here in who do we partner with, and what are they exposed to, whether it's, like they're at the will of it might be an authoritarian regime. You can do business with people in Russia, no problem. Like, not everyone's the Kremlin or like the KGB, but you need to know that they might be forced to an extent to play ball with the Kremlin. They may not want to, but they may have to, and that's going to kind of feed into you a little bit, or at least expose you to kind of the whim of like an authoritarian leader. Supply chain instability, beyond just material shortages, are we exposed to piracy or corruption? This was 2 weeks ago. The Houthi militia sank the Eternity Sea. They filmed it as a big like propaganda thing. They did. They attacked it with drones and boats, boarded it and killed a few of the Filipino crew, and then shot missiles at it and from the land. And did a big propaganda video and just said, pretty much, the Red Sea is ours. Anyone who wants to transact through it, your merchant ships, which is like anyone who's interested in oil, they say you've got to pay the toll. And they're just trying to intimidate. This is far from here, but if you work in oil infrastructure or you import, export, pretty much anything that's passing through the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, even parts of the Indian Ocean, parts of South China Sea, there's still a lot of piracy. There's groups in the Philippines that specialize in, they're like ISIS-linked militias that specialize in piracy still. These are risks that, this is part of the supply chain that is increasingly going to become pretty nasty sometimes for us, because we're a little island at the bottom of the ocean. We need ships coming. Regulatory shifts, green sustainability policies, import and export of sensitive tech data, and privacy and sovereignty. Who should and shouldn't have access to my tech and data? In 2018, if I remember right, I think 2016, there was a little company in Dunedin or something, a little aerospace company, and they designed a nice little Cessna. Took a Cessna and kind of modified it to be super lightweight, super fuel efficient, and kind of really good like power to weight ratio or something. And then they got hit up by a Chinese company and said, hey, we'd like to just buy you out and just have it. So they saw something in that piece of tech. And so they went, yeah, sure. There were no guardrails to say that they need to be careful about the tech or how it might be used. They just said, have it. The Chinese then adapted it into a drone, so it doesn't need a pilot, and then sold it to the North Koreans. And now the North Koreans use that plane that was made in New Zealand, as part of their general military logistics network, and just fly them remotely. And it's like, okay, so that's a dual use technology that the guys who were inventing it here never thought it would be a dual use technology. Dual use means civilian use and military use. There are other ones. There's a case of Massey University a few years ago partnered with a research lab in China on producing facial recognition technology, and then they kind of found out later that the Chinese university funded Massey, gave them heaps of money, gave the professors like 100K sign-on bonuses and all this stuff. Everything was dandy. And then they found out down the line that the CCP, the Chinese government, was using that facial recognition technology to implement the social credit system and just try to oppress people in China. So it's like, okay, these are geopolitical risks. And increasingly it's tech and data is very important. Market volatility, we've all seen this lately. Trump said, I'm going to do this, no I'm not, I'm going to do this, no I'm just kidding, no I'm not kidding. And I'm not a finance guy, and I feel for the finance people in the room, or the finance and insurance people in the room. I don't know how you deal with that, but that's a pretty obvious, pretty salient risk. Sector specific for New Zealand, you've probably got it. People filling each of these in the room, I'd say, at least one of each. If you're a critical infrastructure owner operator, man, if you're not on top of cyber-physical attacks, it's gonna get real, I think, in the next few years. If you own or operate a water treatment plant, you can get cyber-physical attacks where they can kind of get into the system and change the administration of chemicals or flow rate or something or whatever they can mess with. I see Nigel Tom's good, yeah. Centrifuges, nuclear centrifuges, in Iran got attacked by Israel. The classic Stuxnet attack, and this little bit of code went in, and the nuclear centrifuges went really fast and exploded pretty much. Things like this. Also sabotage and espionage. Graham Phillips just been released from prison recently. He's New Zealand's first ever convicted saboteur, who kind of went down the COVID anti-vax rabbit hole and took some power tools out and cut down some power pipelines around Tokyo back in like 2020 or 2021 as a protest against the government. Sabotage critical infrastructure. And I guess it's kind of a geopolitical thing. I think he was influenced by US ideology. Imported culture war is the whole term right now. If you're in the public service, we're increasingly worried about foreign interference, and that also means elite capture and kind of access adjacent. So, if you work at council and you have access to critical infrastructure in your district, a foreign state might have interest in kind of getting access through you. That means your access adjacent. Might schmooze you up, might find out where you live, or might hack into your emails, might do something and kind of use you as a piece of leverage to control either policy or infrastructure or other spending decisions or something of the like. Universities, I just mentioned, Massey, we've got to be increasingly aware of these funding partnership models, who has the IP, where's our research going. A lot of research partnerships, especially with China and New Zealand universities, of which there's heaps, and most of them are all good and mutually beneficial. But there are a few, there will be more in the future that we need to be really careful about our exposure and what our IP, kind of our research ends up being used for. And they offer a lot of money. It looks really juicy, but I'm always saying in the fine print, like at the end of the day, the IP belongs to them. It doesn't stay in New Zealand. Curriculum surveillance. There are international students from all over the world that are here attending universities just to report, not to actually get the degree, but just to report back to the government on what we're teaching and how and who's teaching it. Cyber and data, I'm not a cyber expert, but I'm sure there's a couple in the room at least. Third-party vendor exposure, like Qantas hack recently, that was on a third-party vendor, I think. It was exposed to a lot of user information. More and more data centers are being built, and some of the big firms, Amazon and Microsoft, are building data centers in New Zealand because they see it as a kind of relatively insulated, I guess geopolitically insulated spot, but then there's the natural hazard question, which is a whole other can of worms. But, all our important data is stored in these data centers. Them themselves, how secure are they? Can I, once the Microsoft one is built, or it might already be built, can I just make a homemade grenade, attach it to a $50 drone, and just fly it over it? Probably. And how safe is that? General security, industry stuff, protests, civil unrest, crime, extremism, and some cyber. We at GRC we do a lot of violent extremism and counter-terrorism work with the government, mainly with DPMC, SIS. The violent extremism picture is getting more and more complex in New Zealand. We traditionally group people into a few categories: faith motivated, identity motivated, politically motivated, single issue motivated. More recently, a new label has been invented by the UK, and we've adopted it just the past year or so. That's called MUU, and that means mixed, unclear, unstable. And it's because more and more people, or more and more people emerging where we cannot tie the motivation to one ideology, they're kind of ideology shopping, and that makes them more unpredictable, and it makes them, they can be radicalized like on a dime and decide this is the thing and act on it. So it's kind of, our threat assessments are getting more and more complicated in that realm. And that relates to like private places, security. We talk to schools about that. We talk to, we do security for big events like the Pride Parade and big civic events in public, which are very hard to secure, but we write threat assessments for that. Who might want to do what and why against this crowd of people. If you're in local government, sister cities, I'm sure some of you work at local councils and have a sister city relationship with somewhere overseas, most likely China. And you think, why does some Chinese city that's a tech powerhouse and has like 50 million people want to be a sister city with Palmerston North? I don't know really. It's some sort of influence operation over time. I think not all of it is malign. I think some of them are genuine, just like people-to-people diplomacy and things like that, which is good. And we need to keep that up, especially with competitor states that might want to harm us in the future. We always need to make sure there's people-to-people ties with them, and so we have some positive relationships. Foreign interference, I'd say election interference as well, undermining democracy, infrastructure access I talked about. Media, we saw that Radio New Zealand kind of thing that happened a couple of years ago. They had one guy who was somehow a kind of Russian, someone running a Russian influence operation had got his ear, and consistently over the course of like 20 or so articles, he was kind of editing them to have pro-Kremlin, pro-Russian spin. Really subtle things like that over time is how you shape a public narrative. If you work in media, you need to be really cognizant that someone might always be kind of trying to influence you in subtle ways, and you might not be able to see it straight away. The Mandarin pages are based on Dong Road. I don't know if anyone's driven past it. It's like the green sign by the park. It used to be, I think, New Zealand's biggest Chinese language publication. And the Chinese government kind of literally went to the homes of people that were advertising in the Mandarin pages and knocked on their door and just physically intimidated them and said, you better pull your funding. Because the Mandarin pages is anti-CCP. So they coerced advertisers into and intimidated them into pulling advertising and things like that to try to shut down dissent voices in New Zealand. And then insurance. I mean, nothing I can say that Chris couldn't say better than me 20 minutes ago. But we increasingly at GRC are being asked to do terrorism likelihood ratings for, companies like Aon offer terrorism insurance in Southeast Asia. If you run a mining operation in the Philippines and there's in the jungle in a 20k square radius around you, there's probably like 3 ISIS-linked militias, and you need terrorism insurance. And so we're increasingly looking at things like that, not necessarily in New Zealand. I say that's scary. I hope not ever in New Zealand. Sabotage and espionage, I don't know how that might look, Chris. The sabotage insurance picture of critical infrastructure in the next 10 to 20 years will be a really interesting one. It's not something we're really looking at right now, but I think maybe Craig and Philip opened our eyes to some things. In the news, I'm about to run out of time. What to do? Okay, horizon scanning, always look for signals. Okay, you need to know how to look and where to look for signs of emerging change, and then develop that with some futures modeling, scenario narratives, build out some things. What does this look like in this country? How does that affect us? Within your team, you might need to all have a meeting about common terminology. What do we mean when we're talking about foreign interference? What do we mean when we're talking about espionage? You know, things like this. Ask experts for advice. I don't know. Manage reputational risk, like we talked about. Yeah, do I want to be complicit in what they're doing in that country against that ethnic group? Something like that. You need to be aware of that. Be flexible. The international system is in constant flux, and you essentially need to be in constant flux with it. Stability doesn't mean things stay the same anymore. That was kind of did after the Cold War until maybe like 2010-ish. You know, things were like reasonably stable apart from kind of early 2000s in the Middle East. Now stability is just being able to just go move like this, I think, all the time. Managing geopolitical risk is business as usual. Finally, leadership and communication. Leaders must stand on their principles. Just have a spine. My time is flashing in the OSB one minute. Have a spine with this sort of stuff. Like, I know a lot of you are risk managers, you're not like the CEO or director, you may not have that power to make decisions on who we will work with or won't in geopolitical terms, but I implore you to kind of figure out where you stand on certain issues. Not pick a side per se, but just like set a bunch of moral principles and stand by it. It'll help you navigate some really complex geopolitical situations that arise here and there. Understand terminology and signals in your team. Do blind spot analysis, known unknowns. What do we know that we don't know about the geopolitical situation? And be open about it. You know, we don't know this stuff, so let's find it out. Constructive risk culture, should be for everything, obviously not just geopolitics. You know, risk is everywhere, it's inherent and ever present. Discuss it openly and constructively. Safe reporting. I've talked about some countries today and some conflicts and stuff, and sometimes it's like villainizing them or they're to blame and stuff. But you know, it's much more complicated than that, and it's much more nuanced than that. Okay, so we need safe reporting environments. You know, in your workplace, you have Chinese people in your workplace, Pakistan people in your workplace, Russians in your workplace. Like, this is good. This is what New Zealand is. Everyone needs to feel safe to discuss geopolitical things that are happening, and you know they may not want to discuss it with the team, but you know if you're the risk guy or girl, offer them a safe mechanism. Come talk to me if you're uncomfortable about this protest that's happening based on ethnic lines, or people might be talking about genocide. You know, Gaza. They may feel they need someone comfortable to talk about that. You know, you need to be that person. I think that's it. If you're interested in some GRC stuff, that we publish reports on this stuff: transnational organized crime, extremism, terrorism, geopolitics, foreign interference, critical infrastructure vulnerability. We've got our risk report, which is all of these are free. Just email us, we'll send them to you. The risk report is like 90 pages. Sorry, I wrote it. Cool. Thanks, everyone.